Our next speaker needs no introduction because Laura already introduced him this morning when he spoke. David Allaway is the Senior Policy Analyst for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and this afternoon he's going to present on preventing the wasting of food, goals, measurements, and metrics. Welcome, David.
Okay, thanks for having me back. Got the timer going? Thank you. Okay, so when it comes to food is life, of course, but when it comes to the environment, few materials are as impactful as food. The majority of our land, water withdrawals, pesticide use, water pollution comes from agriculture. As a sector, it is one of our largest users of energy and a massive source of greenhouse gases. Composting and anaerobic digestion are very important solutions, but prevention has even greater potential, and I want to illustrate this with a graph. In 2015, Oregon generated about 500,000 tons of food waste. If all of this waste had been disposed of in our disposal system, the carbon footprint would have looked something like this. These are mostly emissions, methane emissions from landfills shown in blue. In 2015, Oregon didn't landfill all of our food waste. Statewide, we recovered about 8% through a mix of composting and anaerobic digestion. As a side note, I'll mention Oregon's collection programs are almost entirely food only. They do not allow compostable packaging. For what that's worth. Here's the actual carbon footprint of that waste. Landfill emissions in blue are a little bit lower. Over on the left-hand side, you can see this tiny little orange sliver. Negative emissions, that's the carbon stored in soils and the displacement of fossil fuels as a result of energy production at digester units. We have a statewide goal to recover 25% of our food waste in 2 years, and if we meet that goal, the emissions will look like this. It's about a 30% reduction in the carbon footprint of waste, and these impacts landfill methane, carbon storage in soils, fossil fuel displacement from digesters are the emissions that dominate the discussion space in places like Biocycle and Waste Expo. This is how the solid waste community typically looks at food waste, but it is a radically incomplete view because there are massive emissions associated with producing all of this food, much of which at one point was edible and could have been prevented. So let's bring in those upstream emissions. We have to expand the scale, and I'll show them to you now here in green. Now in this frame, composting and digestion barely move the needle. In contrast, let's look at prevention. Oregon has a statutory goal to reduce our generation of waste to 40% below 2012 levels by 2050. If we could achieve that goal in equal proportions across all waste types, including food, the carbon footprint would look something like this. This is only carbon. Other environmental impacts follow similar patterns. If you want to achieve deep cuts in pollution that are necessary, prevention has to be a major part of your portfolio. We need to change the conversation from food waste to wasted food, the edible portion of food, that if we treated it like the sacred, life-sustaining resource that it is, should never have been wasted in the first place. So what is Oregon doing? You can read our strategic plan. It's short, it's online. Its focus is on changing that conversation. This year, we're completing a major measurement study that focuses on the amounts and causes of wasted food, wasted edible food. This is critically important information that hardly anybody has. We're combining surveys, food diaries, and bin sorts to better understand how much edible food is wasted and why. We're also working with 15 commercial businesses to pilot test a wide variety of interventions, such as smaller batch cooking and changing food display practices. And we're working with some folks here in the room, CalRecycle and the City of San Francisco and Oakland, on a potential challenge to industry. We're working with Metro, the Oregon Restaurant and Lodging Association, on a new outreach campaign for its members, and we've developed a similar campaign called Wasted Food, Wasted Money that's designed for local governments in Oregon to use. 2015 legislation in our state created new waste prevention and reuse requirements for larger local governments in Oregon. These are different from the recycling service requirements, and running this campaign is one way in which they can comply. We've also discovered some evidence about public outreach and messaging that requires some attention. In the zero waste field, many people believe that food waste collection enables prevention. When people sort their food, it becomes more visible, and this makes them more likely to be careful and not waste it in the first place. And many of you in this room may have experienced that dynamic firsthand. But it turns out that not everyone thinks the way that we do. We need to be careful to avoid living in an echo chamber. There is, in fact, strong evidence that food waste sorting programs actually lead some people to waste more food. Some people believe that since the problem is a landfill problem, then composting, which keeps the waste out of the landfill, obviates the need to avoid wasting the food in the first place. So this summer, we're undertaking major new research to figure out how to communicate and promote composting and prevention together so that they work in an integrated fashion so that people waste less in the first place and so that composting doesn't undermine the prevention message. Finally, we've refocused our state grants program on preventing the wasting of food. In 25 years prior, we funded a grand total of 1 prevention project. It was at 2 Intel cafeterias. We reduced the wasting of food 47%. That was only 1 project. Last year, we changed our grants and we received 7 projects for true prevention, 6 of which we funded. These are all true prevention projects working with the university, businesses, and residents to waste less food. And this is separate from the significant money that our state has also put into edible food rescue, as California has done. Now, you might look at what I've shared with you today. Reuse, microgrants, deconstruction, small houses, ADUs, wasted food prevention, reusable kegs, and on, and ask, why and how is Oregon doing all of this work around prevention and reuse? And there are several important reasons for it. One is that we inform a lot of our work with environmental science, and the science is clear that a ton of prevention or reuse is typically worth more bang for the buck than recycling or composting. Recycling and composting are necessary, and they are also insufficient. There's also evidence that reuse and prevention, as we heard from the gentleman from Scotland, have greater economic potential. But there's another reason, and that is how Oregon measures our waste. Oregon doesn't have the disposal avoidance goal that the state of California has. Instead, we have 2 goals. The first is a waste recovery goal, the percentage of wastes generated that are recovered. Every year we conduct a major statewide survey that quantifies the tons of materials recycled and composted, and this allows us to calculate a waste recovery rate both for the state and for almost every county. This recovery data, however, serves a second purpose. We add to it disposal tonnages to estimate overall waste generation, actual generation, not imagined generation. And this has led Oregon's legislature to adopt a second goal, which is to reduce overall waste generation, not disposal, but generation. So we have 2 goals, recovery, which empowers compost and recycling programs, and a parallel generation goal that empowers prevention and reuse. This is a generation goal, again, not a disposal goal, and the only way you can achieve it is through working at the top of the hierarchy, and that's a key reason why Oregon takes the hierarchy seriously and invests significant efforts at the top of it. One other reason that goals are important is that they focus the public's attention. Goals communicate to the public what's important, what matters, and they get otherwise disconnected people all pulling in the same direction. So what does a disposal avoidance goal tell the public? What sort of message does it send? I don't know. Maybe it tells the public that landfills are bad and that all other alternatives are equally good. In contrast, Oregon's recovery goal signals that recycling and composting are valuable, and our generation goal signals to the public that it's important to use less stuff in the first place. The state's goals were recently updated and the generation goal was made much more ambitious, but that's just the beginning. 2015 legislation also endorsed a new policy framework, Oregon's 2050 Vision and Framework for Action. This framework directs us to get out of the narrow box of solid waste altogether and to work across the entire life cycle of materials, including, but not limited to, solid waste and the hierarchy. So we're now developing the next generation of measurement in Oregon, and I'll provide a 90-second sneak peek. So why do we recycle and why do we reduce and reuse? Because materials have profound impacts on the environment and the environment is in trouble. We need to conserve resources and reduce pollution. That's our underlying motivation. When you look at the science, it becomes clear that solid waste tonnages are a very poor proxy of environmental impact. Different materials have different impacts. Different recovery pathways have radically different benefits. Prevention is not the same as recycling. Weight-based landfill avoidance goals address none of these important distinctions. They just tell you how heavy your landfills are. And in the grand scheme of environmental problems, heavy landfills are not necessarily at the top of the list. So since our goal is to conserve resources and reduce pollution, that's what we're going to be measuring. Our new measurement framework called INFO, for environmental impacts of material flows in Oregon basically represents a life cycle analysis of all the materials that eventually become solid waste in Oregon, and even a few that don't. We're looking at water use, toxics, energy, climate, and other impacts. In a few years, we're going to start measuring recovery rates in terms of environmental outcomes. We'll communicate the environmental impacts of materials and use this information to shed light on a much broader toolbox of solutions. Solutions that include recycling and composting, prevention and reuse, but also material substitution, cleaner production, and shifts in consumption. We'll have more results to share with you in a couple of years. So that's what we're up to. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
I'm on my way.
Here goes.
Hi, thank you. So, are you guys encouraging the reduction of consumption of any like top good that you see going into the landfill? Like, what is something that people can really be focusing on reducing? Because packaging is a huge thing that goes into landfills, but you can't really avoid the package without avoiding the entire thing that's in the package. So, is there anything that you guys are focusing on to encourage people to reduce?
Yes, we are. Right now, our focus is on prevention, is on food and textiles, clothing, through purchasing more durable clothing and maintaining and caring for clothing. We have a whole other campaign, a state campaign about clothing you can find on our website. We targeted those materials not because of their tonnage in the landfill, but because of their significant environmental impacts across their entire life cycle, and also because they have high emissions intensities, which is a measure of the emissions per dollar spent. There is an inconvenient fact in the world of consumption, which is the rebound effect. That is, when consumers spend less money on something through a conservation activity, they're probably going to use that money on something else. And so if that something else is worse, you're going to increase the overall footprint. So we're targeting materials that have high impacts per dollar, as informed through our consumption-based emissions inventory, that tells us where we should be focusing on trying to shift consumption. Thank you.
Gary List. David, what is the role of local government in this, and have they changed? Who's responsible? Typically, public works departments have been responsible for organizing recycling and composting. Mm-hmm. They're not noted for behavioral change specialists and economists and other types of staffing. So are you seeing changes at the local level coming out of the state initiative?
Actually, some of the change, it's a great question, Gary, and some of the changes predate the 2050 vision, where we had a number of communities move their solid waste or reduce, reuse, recycle programs out of public works or public health and into a new, like a sustainability office. Portland does that, Clackamas County has done that, Eugene has done that. And yes, there is definitely a cultural barrier when you ask the guy who's in charge of the truck drivers to design an outreach program. It's just a bad fit. And so we really believe that ultimately the role of local governments in prevention and reuse is going to be much more variable than it is. They all have a role in recycling. As I said, the new state requirements on local governments only target and affect the larger local governments who we believe should be capable of pulling off some what are pretty minor requirements. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you.